Nestled among the tree-lined hills of eastern Pennsylvania is the town of Maplefield, a quiet place, known more for its fall festivals and antique fairs than anything you'd find in a crime blotter. With a population just under 12,000, it was the kind of town where people rarely locked their doors and children rode bikes past white-fenced lawns until sunset. Churches outnumbered bars, and the volunteer fire department still hosted pancake breakfasts on the first Saturday of each month. But beneath the Norman Rockwell exterior, Maplefield held a secret, a long-buried thread of darkness that would only begin to unravel decades after it had begun. And at the center of it all was the Whitlock family. Harold and Marion Whitlock moved to Maplefield in the summer of 1989. He was a retired Air Force chaplain, she a former school teacher from Georgia. Together they bought a large colonial-style home on Willow Lane, the kind of house you'd find in a postcard. Symmetrical windows, black shutters, a sweeping front porch with hanging ferns. Locals remember them fondly. At first, Harold always offered a firm handshake and a warm smile, and Marion brought fresh-baked bread to church picnics. They were devout, kind, and unfailingly polite. To many in town, the Whitlocks seemed like the embodiment of moral strength. By 1993, the couple had taken in their first child, a quiet, dark-haired boy named Miguel, said to be a distant relative of Marion's from her estranged brother's side. 2 years later, a teenage girl from Ohio named Lacey arrived. Then came twins from Mississippi, a Vietnamese boy, a mute girl from a church group in Alabama. Over the span of nearly 20 years, the Whitlocks would take in more than 17 children, none ever officially adopted, none ever officially fostered. Yet no one in Maplefield seemed to question it too closely. People just assumed they were doing God's work, one neighbor, Eleanor Pritchard, would later tell reporters. We all thought they were saints. The town's admiration for the Whitlocks grew steadily. They opened a small religious counseling center behind their house in 1999, what they called a healing ministry, offering scripture-led guidance and trauma recovery sessions. Marion taught Sunday school. Harold gave guest sermons. They became godparents to other children in the parish. Even the mayor once remarked that Maplefield was blessed to have them. But behind the pristine curtains of that Willow Lane home, something else had begun to take root, something ritualistic, rigid, and quietly cruel. The earliest known indication of what was happening came in the fall of 2004, when a nurse at St. Joseph's Medical Center filed a brief handwritten report about a girl brought in with signs of malnutrition. According to the intake record, the girl, identified only as Amy W., was approximately 11 years old, underweight for her age, and presented with signs of chronic sleep deprivation and minor contusions on her forearms. Harold Whitlock had accompanied her to the E.M., explaining she had trouble eating and suffered from night terrors. He left with her before the attending physician could complete the exam. The nurse, Lisa Banford, filed the report with Child Protective Services, but nothing ever came of it. When questioned later, a county caseworker admitted the referral had been closed after a single phone call to the Whitlocks, who assured them Amy was receiving spiritual counseling and had suffered early childhood trauma. There were no follow-up visits. Over the years, other small red flags would surface. A boy named Jonah, who vanished from church choir and was said to have returned to his family. A teenage girl seen walking barefoot in the snow behind the Whitlock's property. A child who recoiled from touch during a school field trip. But each time, the Whitlocks offered calm, biblical explanations, fasting, prayer retreats, episodes of divine revelation, and the community, eager to believe in their goodness, accepted it. It wasn't until 2011 that the first real investigation began, triggered by someone new to town, a woman named Dana Rowe, who had recently moved to Maplefield to care for her aging mother. Dana was a licensed social worker with 20 years' experience in urban child welfare programs. Quiet, observant, and not easily intimidated, she volunteered at the local food pantry where she first noticed something odd. 2 of the Whitlock children, young girls, maybe 8 or 9, arrived with the church group, both pale and listless, with thin arms and deep circles under their eyes. They didn't speak. They didn't make eye contact. One flinched when Dana reached to hand her a juice box. Dana's instincts told her something was wrong. Over the following weeks, she tried to learn more, asking unobtrusive questions, watching how the children behaved at church and in town. What she found unsettled her. Each of the Whitlock children displayed subtle but consistent signs of emotional suppression, flat affect, startle reflex, avoidant behavior. They rarely attended school and were almost never seen without either Harold or Marion nearby. She contacted the school district, but was told the Whitlock children were homeschooled, registered under a private religious co-op. When she reached out to the church, the response was cordial but cold. "They're good people," the pastor said. "A little strict, maybe, but nothing harmful." It wasn't until Dana confided in a friend at the county health department that her concerns reached someone with real authority. Detective Mark Leland, a 10-year veteran of the Maple County Sheriff's Office. Leland had a reputation for thoroughness, and though initially skeptical, he agreed to conduct a quiet background check. What he found was troubling. None of the children listed as living at the Whitlock home had legal adoption records. Several didn't have birth certificates on file in Pennsylvania. A few weren't even documented in any federal or state registry. There was no record of formal foster care placement, and no indication that any private agency had vetted the Whitlocks. In short, the family existed in a bureaucratic gray zone 1 that Harold, a former military chaplain, seemed to understand all too well. Digging deeper, Leland reviewed emergency call records and flagged a few unusual entries. A 911 hang-up from the Whitlock residence in 2007, a noise complaint from a neighbor about chanting, heard around midnight in 2010, a missing persons report filed for a child named Benjamin Cruz in 2002 closed the following year with no explanation. Each clue on its own was inconclusive, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet accumulation of whispers that pointed to something more than neglect. In early 2012, Leland approached the district attorney's office requesting permission for a formal investigation. His request was denied. The Whitlocks were beloved in Maplefield, and without hard evidence, the DA warned any public inquiry would be viewed as harassment. Still, Leland persisted interviewing former neighbors, combing through school withdrawal notices, checking national missing children databases. Eventually, he stumbled across a lead that would crack the case open. It came from an anonymous letter mailed to the sheriff's office and marked only with the initials CW. The letter, scrawled in uneven handwriting, claimed that they keep the bad ones underground and referred to a sin cellar where prayers are screamed, not said. Enclosed was a faded Polaroid of what appeared to be a basement room bare concrete, a rusted cot and a red circle drawn crudely on the floor. Forensic analysis dated the photo to around 2008. The materials in the image, particularly the faded carpet fragment and a chipped wall, matched archival property records of the Whitlock basement, which had been remodeled that same year. Armed with a letter, Leland returned to the DA, and this time he brought back up a psychological profile drafted by Dana Rowe and a former FBI analyst she'd consulted. The profile detailed a likely pattern of trauma conditioning, ritual abuse, and coercive belief systems often found in closed religious cults. On March 19, 2013, a search warrant was signed. At 6:12 a.m., local and state officers raided the Whitlock home. What they found would haunt the town for years. In the basement were 3 children, 2 boys, and 1 girl locked in what authorities described as segregated isolation units, each the size of a walk-in closet. The rooms were soundproofed and unlit, with thin mattresses, a bucket for waste, and no windows. One child, identified later as 9-year-old Caleb, had open sores and a body weight nearly 30 pounds below average for his age. In the attic, officers found what appeared to be a prayer chamber, a circular room lined with mirrors, salt markings, and leather-bound journals filled with handwritten scripture interpretations. Many of the passages spoke of transference, vessel purity, and the idea that sin could be removed from one soul and passed into another. Over the next 48 hours, a forensic team uncovered buried remains in the wooded area behind the house, 3 small graves, all unmarked. Dental records and DNA later identified the victims as Benjamin Cruz, age 6, Lacey Turner, age 13, and an unknown female child believed to be approximately 10 years old. All had died sometime between 2000 and 2008. The causes of death ranged from starvation to blunt force trauma. The arrest of Harold and Marion Whitlock stunned the town of Maplefield. Neighbors wept on camera, unable or perhaps unwilling to reconcile the kindly couple they'd known for over 2 decades, with the horrors unfolding inside the white colonial on Willow Lane. Reporters flooded the town square. Satellite trucks lined the main street for days. Church leaders issued statements of shock and sorrow, distancing themselves from the couple they had once called pillars of the community. But for the victims and those who had quietly questioned the Whitlocks for years, the truth was finally beginning to surface. Over the next several weeks, as state investigators combed through hundreds of pages of journals, photographs, and personal effects found in the Whitlock home, a clearer picture began to emerge. At the heart of it was a belief system the couple had developed over many years, one that twisted Christian theology into something punitive and selective. According to Harold's handwritten entries, which spanned over 20 years, children were divided into 2 spiritual categories, the redeemables and the vessels. Redeemables were believed to carry the spark of divine possibility, souls damaged but salvageable through discipline, fasting, and intense spiritual correction. Vessels, on the other hand, were chosen, or rather condemned, to absorb the sin, fear, and impurity of the others. In one particularly chilling entry, dated October 12, 2003, Harold wrote, "Tonight, the vessel screamed again. Marion says the redeemables are purging more easily now. The circle must be redrawn with fresh salt before dawn. Another journal contained detailed logs of rituals carried out in the attic prayer chamber, sessions of isolation, forced confessions, self-flagellation, and group recitations that lasted well into the night. Many of the entries were written in what appeared to be coded references, with children referred to only by initials or religious monikers. The Ashen, Lamb, Bearer 12, the Hollow Mouth. Authorities later confirmed that at least 5 of the 17 children who had passed through the Whitlock home could not be located in any state or federal database. Some were eventually found alive, placed with distant relatives, or taken in by other religious families, but several remained unaccounted for. During interviews, the surviving children revealed a terrifying consistency in their recollections. According to Caleb, the 9-year-old boy found in the basement, there were designated days of atonement when the vessels were locked away while the redeemables were made to confess their sins aloud, often while fasting or standing in cold water. The vessels, he said, would take on those sins by being present, but silent, eyes closed, sometimes bound. In a recorded psychological evaluation, Caleb said softly, "They told us if we were loud, the badness wouldn't go in, right? So we had to be still, even when it hurt." Court records would later show that Marion was primarily responsible for the rituals and spiritual doctrine. She believed she had been given a vision in 1988 months before moving to Maplefield, during which a voice, which she claimed was divine, instructed her to begin a cleansing house. This voice, she wrote, had told her that the world was ending in phases, and that only those who had been filtered through suffering would be allowed through the veil into God's next creation. Forensic psychologists called it a form of messianic delusional disorder, compounded by trauma, religious obsession, and unchecked authority. In one of the case files, Dr. Evelyn Darrow, a trauma expert brought in to consult on the children's treatment, noted the Whitlocks engineered a closed system where dissent was framed as spiritual disobedience, and pain was a necessary threshold for grace. The children were indoctrinated not just with fear, but with a complete redefinition of love, redemption, and personal worth. The legal proceedings began 6 months after the raid. Harold Whitlock was charged with multiple counts of felony child abuse, manslaughter, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit ritualistic harm. Marion faced similar charges, along with additional counts of psychological torture and neglect resulting in death. Their attorneys attempted an insanity plea, but after a battery of court-ordered evaluations, the motion was denied. Both were deemed competent to stand trial. The prosecution presented more than 300 pieces of evidence: photographs, journal entries, forensic findings, medical records. Survivors testified behind closed doors, protected by anonymity. 2 of them, now in their 20s, described being forced to fast for up to 7 days while praying over a bound vessel child lying on the floor in the dark. One recalled Marion whispering prayers in Latin while cutting their hair, a symbolic act, she had said, to release impurities. One journal entry dated March 3, 2006, described a young boy named Thomas being offered as the container after he spoke back during Bible study. He was removed from the main house for 42 days. His remains were never recovered. Despite the weight of the evidence, the defense pushed back. They argued that the couple had, in their own warped way, believed they were helping. that their actions were misguided acts of spiritual desperation, not malice. But the jury did not agree. On November 18, 2014, after just 6 hours of deliberation, Harold and Marion Whitlock were found guilty on all counts. The judge, visibly shaken during sentencing, referred to their home as a monument to perverted faith and generational cruelty. He sentenced them each to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, the town of Maplefield was forced into a reckoning. The church where Harold once guest preached removed all photographs of the couple. The counseling center was demolished, its lot turned into a public garden and memorial site. Local lawmakers passed new ordinances, tightening regulations on religious homeschool co-ops and strengthening oversight on private child care arrangements. But for those who lived through it, the survivors, the neighbors, even Detective Leland, the healing would be slow. Dana Rowe, the social worker whose persistence had triggered the investigation, returned briefly to testify during the trial. She was later awarded a state medal for her service, though. She declined most interviews. The signs were always there, she said during her final statement. People just didn't want to see them. For months after the trial, mental health professionals worked with the surviving children, many of whom exhibited complex PTSD, dissociative behaviors, and religious trauma syndrome. A state-sponsored rehabilitation home was established just outside Harrisburg, one of the first of its kind in the country, designed to support survivors of spiritual abuse in familial settings. Among the journals recovered from the Whitlock home, one final entry stood out. It was undated, written in Marion's careful, curling script. "We have sown what must be reaped. The world will tremble when it understands that pain is the last honest language." To this day, no one can say for certain how many children passed through the Whitlock's doors. Some survivors have chosen to speak out publicly, while others have vanished into the folds of anonymity, rebuilding lives. Far from the shadow of Willow Lane, in Maplefield, the trees still bloom every spring. The pancake breakfasts continue. But there's a solemnity, now a quiet acknowledgement that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears an apron and reads scripture. Sometimes it sings in the church choir and bakes for the neighbors. And sometimes it hides in plain sight. In the months that followed the sentencing of Harold and Marion Whitlock, Maplefield slowly returned to its rhythms. But those rhythms had changed. Local schools brought in trauma counselors. Church services included new sermons on vigilance and humility. A community that had once taken pride in its insularity was now forced to reckon with the fact that isolation had allowed unspeakable cruelty to fester unchecked for decades. For those closest to the investigation, the work didn't end with the conviction. Detective Leland Simmons, who had risked his career pursuing a case no one wanted, was promoted quietly and reassigned to a special task force on interagency child protection. Even with the commendations and the official closure, Simmons found himself haunted by what had been missed. "There were moments I'd lie awake," he told a local podcast host months after the trial, "thinking about how many times I'd driven past that house and waved. Thinking about the kids we didn't find." Despite all the evidence, there were still unanswered questions. The recovered journals hinted at children who had never been registered through official channels. Children with no school records, no medical files, no adoption paperwork. Some, like Thomas and E.S. were referenced only through initials and ritualistic titles. In one journal from 1997, Marion had written, "The hollow mouth cries again, he is not ready. We must prepare another vessel to draw the sin from him before the solstice." Simmons, now working with state investigators, oversaw a renewed effort to identify these so-called forgotten children. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search nearby woodlands. Old foundations on the Whitlock property were excavated. Unmarked graves were discovered in a wooded glen less than half a mile from the main house shallow, hastily covered, each one bearing a small wooden cross carved with a single letter. 5 sets of remains were recovered. 3 were ultimately matched through DNA analysis. 2 remain unidentified. Forensic anthropologists determined the remains belonged to children between the ages of 6 and 12. All were severely malnourished. 2 had healed fractures consistent with prior abuse. 1 had traces of a homemade sedative in their bone marrow. It was likely derived from valerian root, commonly used in folk rituals. Simmons attended each burial. He would later describe standing by those graves, feeling both justice and futility in equal measure. "You get the bad guys, but you never get the years back for the kids," he said. "You can't give them what they lost. You can't unmake the silence that let it happen." Among the most disturbing discoveries made in the post-trial investigation were the video recordings. Hidden behind a false panel in the basement wall, investigators found 3 weathered VHS tapes inside a locked tin. Each was labeled with dates and a strange symbol, a circle bisected by a cross. The content was grainy, filmed by hand and without audio. The tapes showed dimly lit rooms, children kneeling in rows, blindfolded, unmoving. In some frames, Harold's figure could be seen pacing in robes, holding a large Bible. In others, Marion appeared to perform rituals using chalk and ash. The tapes were not shown in court. Selected stills were used to corroborate testimonies and journal entries. Law enforcement described them as deeply disturbing and not for public release. 1 officer reportedly vomited during the first viewing. The public, of course, wanted more. Conspiracy forums circulated exaggerated versions of the case. Sensationalized documentaries misrepresented facts. Some even claimed the Whitlocks were part of a broader cult, or that their rituals had supernatural consequences. But for those who lived through it, the truth was horrifying enough. Survivor testimony began appearing in vetted interviews. 1 young woman, known publicly only as Mira, appeared in a 60-minute documentary. She spoke of being adopted by the Whitlocks at age 7 after her parents died in a house fire. For months, she said, things were normal. She attended school. She had toys. But then came the divisions, the separating of children based on unexplained behaviors. One night she wet the bed, and the next morning she was moved to a different room. "That was when I became a vessel," she said. "They took my name away. I wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to. They shaved my head and said it would help my soul become invisible so I could carry the pain without corrupting it." Mira was one of the few vessels who survived and escaped. She now works as a trauma counselor, helping survivors of spiritual abuse. Other survivors took different paths. 1, known only as Eli, disappeared after the trial. He was 17 and refused all interviews. Another, a boy named Matthew, was adopted by a family who shielded him from the media. His therapist later confirmed he was legally blind in one eye, a result of untreated injury from prolonged light deprivation. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. The Whitlocks had not operated in a vacuum. While they were the architects of their twisted doctrine, they had benefited from the passive complicity of dozens neighbors, church leaders, and social workers. One retired pediatrician, Dr. Richard Mulvaney, had treated several of the Whitlock children. In a 2008 file, he noted signs of possible malnutrition. He never filed a report. Years later, Mulvaney wrote, "I convinced myself they were just strict, that the kids were clumsy, that they were homeschooled and odd but well-mannered. I see now that I was complicit in my silence." The town of Maplefield tried to move forward. A memorial was built on the site of the Whitlock home, which had been razed. It was a simple structure, a stone circle with 17 small pillars, one for each known child. Each pillar bore a single word. A plaque at the entrance read, "For the lost, the hidden, and the unheard. May we never again turn away." Legislators used the case to pass vessel laws across the state reforms to improve interagency communication between child protection and institutions. One law required any home with more than 2 foster or adopted children to undergo annual psychological evaluations and unannounced visits. Despite the reforms, critics argued systemic change remained slow. Social worker Dana Rowe, who had first raised red flags, testified before the legislature. The Whitlocks didn't hide. They hosted barbecues. They volunteered. They opened their doors. "We didn't fail because we couldn't see. We failed because we didn't look closely enough when it was uncomfortable." Years later, the name Whitlock still casts a shadow in child welfare training. Their doctrine and signs of abuse are now part of official case studies. The horror they wrought has become a textbook lesson in what evil looks like when it wears a neighbor's face. In a rare interview with the surviving detective, Leland Simmons was asked what stayed with him the most. He didn't mention the journals, or the graves, or even the tapes. He said, "It's the silence. The way those kids learned to cry without making a sound. That's what I hear in my sleep." In the years that followed, the Whitlock case became more than a singular tragedy. It became a reference point in the national conversation about the unseen spaces where harm can flourish under the guise of sanctity. Journalists, authors, and documentarians dissected every detail. College courses in social work and criminal justice used the case as a study in missed intervention. But beneath academic debate, there was a quieter, more unsettling truth. The Whitlocks were not monsters in the classical sense. They were ordinary, and that ordinariness made them terrifying. Harold had been a scoutmaster. Marion led a Bible study. Their lawn was trimmed, bills paid. They waved at neighbors. For decades they lived out their twisted theology in plain sight. But not everyone stayed silent. 2 years after the convictions, Elizabeth Carver came forward. She had worked with Marion at the Maplefield Community Counseling Center in the mid-90s when it first opened. Carver, a newly certified addiction counselor at the time, said clients felt judged or spiritually invaded by Marion. One was told she was too impure to heal unless she donated to a church account. Another young man battling depression was dismissed from the center for missing a prayer circle Marion said was mandatory. Carver raised concerns with the director. Nothing happened. They said Marion had seniority, she wrote, that she brought in the most clients, that I was too sensitive. Eventually, Carver left, but the guilt lingered. Years later, she was interviewed in a follow-up investigation. She recalled how Marion used coded religious language, kept certain files locked, and how children often looked at their shoes during sessions. It wasn't obvious, Carver said, but I felt something wrong in my body before I could explain it in my head. That gut feeling ignored intuition was common in the Whitlock's story. People sensed something was off. A teacher noticed a child always wore long sleeves. A postal worker glimpsed the same kids in the upstairs window. But the Whitlocks were respected, and no one felt they had the right to question. That silence cost lives. One survivor, Samantha Dilley, had been adopted by the Whitlocks after her mother died of an overdose. Seen as a model child, she lived in their home for nearly a decade. Behind closed doors, she endured scrutiny, scripture memorization, weekly fasts, and what Marion called cleansing circles. In those circles, the redeemables stood over the vessels and recited, "Sin must fall like ash into the hollow. Only through the empty may the full be saved." In a 2021 podcast interview, Samantha shared the guilt she carried. "They made me believe I was lucky," she said, "that I was chosen to be saved. And part of that meant letting bad things happen to the others." Her voice trembled. "I didn't know what they meant at the time. I didn't understand what they were doing to the vessels. But I saw things, heard things, and I stayed quiet. That's what I'm trying to forgive myself for." Samantha now runs a nonprofit for spiritual abuse survivors. She hosts retreats, speaks at conferences, and has helped change laws in 3 counties. Still, she says, healing isn't linear. "There are days I still think like they taught me, that suffering is holy, that silence is strength. It takes work to remember those were lies." Other survivors struggled more. Some battled addiction, poverty, incarceration. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. It taught children to see themselves as impure, broken, expendable, and those invisible wounds were the hardest to treat. Dr. Evelyn Darrow, the psychologist who consulted on the trial, continued treating survivors for years afterward. In her notes, she wrote, "The doctrine taught in that home was not just abusive, it was viral. It replicated inside the children. Undoing that takes years. And even then, some of the infection remains." In 2020, the state issued a formal apology to the survivors. Symbolic with no legal weight, but it was the first official admission of failure. At the ceremony on the Whitlock property, 17 candles were lit, 1 for each known child, and 1 unlit for those never found. A plaque listed the names of survivors who chose to be acknowledged: Caleb, Myra, Samantha, Matthew. Below the names, the words, "May we learn to listen when silence speaks." The ceremony wasn't publicized. No press, just families, survivors, and a few advocates who never left. Dana Rowe was there. So was Detective Simmons. Simmons, retired, spoke briefly. His words were quiet, unrehearsed. "I used to think evil looked like chaos, blood, rage, madness, but the worst evil I've seen looked like routine, like a prayer circle, like clean floors and polite smiles. He placed a wooden cross on the marker unfinished with a notch made in his garage. He gave no explanation. Later that night, someone left a note under the plaque. It wasn't signed. It read, "I was there. I survived. I remember." No one knows who left it, but it's still there, laminated, framed in glass. A reminder that memory endures even when names fade. And maybe that's the story's final truth. Not the rituals, not the trial, not the convictions, but the persistence of those who lived. The quiet bravery of children who endured the unthinkable. The people who chose at last to speak. They called it the House on Elder's Hill, though the name never appeared on any official record. Locals used it as a shorthand, a way to reference the Whitlock residents without saying their names. It sat on a slight elevation above Maplefield's east side, behind a veil of sycamore and oak trees, overlooking the town like a monument to what everyone wished they could forget. After the memorial ceremony and the installation of the stone ring, the town board quietly rezoned the land. There would be no development, no parks, no public access. The area was left intentionally quiet, overgrown, with thyme and wildflowers, with a narrow path for those who needed to visit. And on occasion, some did. Reporters would still try to sneak onto the grounds, hoping for a new angle, a photograph of grief. Most were turned away. One was arrested after trying to dig up what he claimed was a hidden chamber. There was none. Every inch had been searched. There was nothing left to find, at least. Nothing physical, but the story continued to echo. A few years later, in 2023, a team of university researchers published a study on group indoctrination and silent complicity, using the Whitlock case as a central example. The paper sparked controversy for including psychological assessments of Harold and Marion, sourced from trial records and post-conviction evaluations. Those evaluations revealed something chilling. Marion, when examined by forensic psychologist Dr. Lyle Corson, was diagnosed with a rare cluster of personality disorders, most notably narcissistic and obsessive-compulsive personality traits, coupled with religious delusions. But she was not deemed legally insane. She understood right from wrong, Corson wrote in his report. She simply believed she was above the distinction. Harold's profile was even more unsettling. While initially diagnosed with dependent personality disorder, he was later found to exhibit a distinct form of moral disengagement, a psychological mechanism by which individuals separate themselves from the consequences of their actions through ideology, loyalty, or religious framework. Corson noted, he viewed himself not as a perpetrator, but as a necessary instrument, a purifier. He was in his own mind a servant of something sacred. That belief system had been meticulously constructed. Investigators recovered handwritten manuscripts, some as long as 60 pages, where Harold outlined their theology. It was a bastardization, a Protestant scripture, infused with apocryphal references and folk mysticism. Concepts like the hollow vessel, the bleeding mirror, and the weight of light repeated throughout, each symbol tied to a specific behavior or ritual imposed on the children. One line from Harold's writings stood out in particular. The sin must have somewhere to go. Let the child with nothing hold the darkness of those we hope to save. This ideology, the foundation of the Whitlock's cruelty, didn't just survive their arrest. It spread. In 2024, authorities in northern Kentucky investigated a religious group operating out of an old farmhouse. The group, calling themselves the Hollow Grace, had used language and structures eerily similar to those found in the Whitlock's journals. At least 3 of the members had previously lived in Maplefield. No charges were filed in that case, but it served as a grim reminder. Doctrines, even ones built on horror, rarely die with their originators. In response, a coalition of survivor-led organizations launched the Light for the Hidden initiative, a grassroots program aimed at identifying signs of spiritual abuse and helping children extricate themselves from dangerous domestic environments masked as religious households. The group trained social workers, lobbied state legislatures, and distributed a checklist to school counselors nationwide titled, "When Faith Feels Like Fear." The initiative was funded partly by anonymous donations, though some suspected it came from former Maplefield residents trying to make amends. One such former resident, a woman named Lee Randall, wrote a letter to the survivors, later published in the Maplefield Gazette. She had grown up down the street from the Whitlocks. Her children had played in their yard. She had brought them cookies every Christmas. In her letter, she wrote, "I thought they were just strict, that maybe you were troubled or difficult. I never imagined what was really happening in that house. And that's the part I can't stop thinking about, that my ignorance wasn't neutral, it was dangerous. I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions." Letters like Lee's arrived more and more as the years passed. Some from former neighbors, others from teachers, grocery clerks, even churchgoers who had attended services with the Whitlocks for years. They spoke of guilt, of missed signs, of casual dismissals. And while these letters couldn't undo the past, they formed a new kind of record, a public archive of acknowledgement, of people willing, finally, to name what they had ignored. For the survivors, healing took many forms. Some found peace in distance-changing names, relocating, severing all ties to Maplefield. Others stayed. They built new families, or rebuilt the broken pieces of the old ones. Some spoke publicly. Others never did, but they lived. Each year, on the anniversary of the raid, a vigil was held at the Elders Hill Memorial. Small, quiet, mostly local. The children, now adults, stood side by side. Some brought their own children. Some came alone. Candles were lit. Names were read aloud. And for one night, the silence that had once hidden so much became a space for remembrance and for love. Detective Simmons attended those vigils until his death in 2028. On the final one before he passed, he stood with a cane in hand and a scarf around his neck. He didn't speak, but he stood among the survivors, his presence heavy with meaning. His family later shared that Simmons had left a journal of his own. In it, he wrote, "I've seen what happens when we let respect replace responsibility. I've seen what happens when we love reputation more than truth. If there's anything I hope we've learned, it's this: the most dangerous place for a child is in the care of someone we're too polite to question." That quote is now engraved on a bench near the memorial. It sits beneath the trees, near where the Whitlocks once hosted Sunday picnics, near where they preached their doctrine of pain, near where the children once stood barefoot in the cold and learned to be invisible. Now they are seen. They are remembered, and their names live on, not as victims, but as voices, quiet, brave and enduring, because in every quiet town there's a story no one wants to believe until it's too late. And in Maplefield, they will never forget again